So let's resume on our conversation we started in our interview in Fuerteventura, where you mentioned that it's not ideal if athletes go out on a bike ride and then they stop again after maybe half an hour or an hour to fill up with carbs. And that created quite a few questions, and I would like you to help explain why you don't think it's a good idea and what is a better idea, and maybe you could explain the difference in between overall performance that might be driven by carbs and then the longer term ability to use fat as a energy form, and how you stimulate or how you train them.
Of course, I really understand why people asking questions, because it's also quite controversial, and it's I would also say it's not always 100% scientifically proven what people do when it comes to, for example, fasted training, so training without fueling before the session. So but first of all, of course, we all agree that it's when you do an Ironman, or even if you do a 4.5 hour or 5 hour middle distance race, you can't do that just on the fuel that you stored before the race or whatever. That lasts probably, depending on the athlete and depending on the intensity, for maybe 2 hours. And so you have to refuel, and that's one of the most important things in our sport, is how do you get the energy in? And it's just like a sports car, and you drive full gas, and at one point the tank is empty. The engine doesn't help you anymore. You might have the best engine, but if there's no fuel, it's done. So either you try to get the car more efficient or you refuel. And what we try to do is we do both. We get it more efficient and to refuel at the same time. So you have to be able to do two things, and that's the reason why it sparks a lot of questions, I think. First of all, you have to be able to utilize carbohydrates during a race, and that's only possible if you're used to it. So if you are doing a hard, longer session, of course it's necessary to refuel. It's actually quite important, because it's also something that you can train. Only by refueling you can teach the body how to actually digest more carbs during exercise. So it's important to refuel, but it's important to know when it makes sense to try to refuel and when it's not a good idea to refuel. So how do you improve burning how do you improve the system to burn more fat during a race? First of all, it's always good if you make a performance test where you can find out, okay, at what power does my system, my body actually utilize the most amount of fat. Depending on who you ask and what system you use, it's called fat max. And so that's one way to boost your fat metabolism, is spending a lot of time in this area. So for example, for me, let's say fat max is around 280 watts, and that means when I ride the mountains here and I want to improve fat metabolism, I always either try to spend quite some time at that power, or I do some over-unders. Let's say, for example, I have like 4 or 5 climbs that day, and I always do like 5 minutes at 260 and 5 minutes at 300 watts. So you always go up and down. And in a session like this, that might be 4.5, 5 hours, of course you're allowed to eat carbs, because it's not true that you don't burn fat when you eat carbs. It's always a mix.
Question of a mix.
Exactly. And what you want to do is the body burns fat in the fuel, in the fire of the carbs. That's not a question. So when you have the choice, I either need to lower my power or I have to eat. You always eat and try to keep the power up there. But that's for a session that lasts 4.5, 5 hours and are at quite a high intensity.
So the end of that 4.5 hour done that way, you're saying you're going to have stimulated your fat oxidation. So you're teaching your body to use more fat, and you're trying to keep the carbs maybe at the minimum. So what you're not going to do is after an hour going to the bakery and refuel for 20 minutes.
Exactly.
So that you keep that fat oxidation going for as long as possible.
But for example, after like 1.5 hours, yes, I might eat a bar.
So you top it off with carbs?
So that I can keep the power high. And but then there might be another session, and it's just 1.5 or 2 hours. And during these 1.5 or 2 hours, my average power might be 230, 235, and I do that on a trainer, and I maybe it's just touch sometimes the 280 watts. So I do probably 2 minutes at 280 watts, and then 8 minutes at 235 watts or something like that. And at that session, it's quite short compared to the other session. I try to really do that with a very low amount of carbs already in my body. So glycogen, very low. So do that fasted, even probably.
So you might have had dinner, then you get up in the morning, no breakfast, you do the session, so you're low in glycogen.
Exactly.
And it's short, relatively low, and you again stimulate your body to burn fat.
Okay. Exactly.
And what's an example of when you go hard, of course, I would assume when you do hard intervals, then you make sure your glycogen stores are full, and you eat during or in between the intervals to be able to do the 350, whatever, 400 watts, high intensity stuff.
Exactly. Okay. Even if I do a session that's just 2 hours long, so in theory I don't really need to eat anything. But when I do like really high intense intervals, I even eat at this session, I try to eat like 70 grams of carbs per hour. If the session gets longer, I even try to get to the maximum of like 90 or 95 grams of carbs per hour, because it's, like I said, we try to get the engine as efficient as possible, but also teach the car how to refuel on the fly.
Like Formula One.
Exactly.
Okay, so that would be the analogy. Okay, cool.
But of course, also to just touch on that, there's a lot of other ideas about that. I mean, I know if you Google ketogenic diet or whatever, you will find a lot about that. But the thing is really, this works. We know this works. With every other thing, it's some kind of a voodoo
we need
science.
to find out if it works.
Yeah.
And the other thing that is important, it works for you. Which is
exactly. I mean, that's the thing. I think I never got beaten by an athlete who is like a ketogenic on a ketogenic diet. I don't think so.
And last question, that applies for, of course, not for swinging, but for running and riding both ways. Or
sure. I mean, on the run, it's
harder to eat.
I mean, it's difficult to do sessions that are 5 hours long. So it's usually not like that important of a topic when it comes to running.
But you still train your body to consume carbs during longer runs or high intensity.
Yes, I think that's something a lot of people forget. For example, especially during swimming, I think it's quite important, because often the people do the swim as the last session of the day or whatever in the evening, and then they go there. They already have done quite some training, and then they don't drink or eat anything during the swim session. And I always would recommend, if it's an intense swim session, you actually try to get quite some carbs in, and it's before as well as during the swim. Okay. So you just have a bottle with your isotonic sports drink, and you're gonna drink that during the swim, because it's not only beneficial for your performance during the swim, and also your brain has to work quite well during the swim, because if you do technique drills and stuff like that, it's important to have a
sure. But on the other side, in a race situation, you don't have your bottle.
Sure, of course, that's totally right. But it's at the beginning of the race and not at the end.
Yeah,
and a
after,
lot of
okay.
people have to swim at the end of the day, and then it's also important because recovery. It's very important for recovery because you will recover way faster from a session if you have carbs during the session.
If you're not completely empty.
Exactly, and also a lot of people think, oh yeah, but then I gain weight if I. But no, that's not true, because you don't come home and you're like completely hangry and run to the fridge and then eat everything you have inside. So therefore it's actually sometimes it can also help with weight loss if you have carbs during your session.
All right. Okay, very good. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.